Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion hosted by the Royal Society of Canada on policy pathways to net zero. I'm Hannah Hoag, the Deputy Editor and Environment and Energy Editor at The Conversation Canada, and we have an enthusiastic and informative panel set up for you today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items for you. English and French interpretation is available today. If you're not hearing me in the language of your preference, please go back to your agenda and choose the other stream. If you require any assistance, please send a message through the chat box and someone on the RSC team will reach out to you. And if you have a question you want to ask, you can do that through the Q&A chat box on your right. You can add your questions at any point during this panel, and we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the session to ask some of them. So, let's get started on this. The planet has already warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius, and scientists say that global emissions from fossil fuels must be cut in half this decade if we are to keep global average temperatures from rising past the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Beyond that threshold, the risks of deadly heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and floods will rise considerably. Canada has said that it will meet its net zero emissions by 2050. This will mean shifting our energy sources and technologies to those that don't produce greenhouse gas emissions. It'll also mean removing carbon from the atmosphere and finding ways to store it. But how will we get there? There are many ways policy can help Canada get to net zero, and this is exactly the topic that our panel will be discussing today, right on the heels of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, Scotland. Our hope is to offer some insights and clarity on the subject and to answer some of your pressing questions. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists for today. First, we have Dale Beugin from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. He's an expert in climate change policy and economics, and he leads the Institute's research and policy advice on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and clean growth. Next, we have Catherine Harrison. She's a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. She previously worked as a policy analyst for Environment Canada and for the US Congress. Next, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Winter. She is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Calgary, where she's also the scientific director of the Energy and Environmental Policy Research Division at the School of Public Policy. Thank you all for joining us. The theme of today's discussion, of course, is the policy pathways for Canada to reach net zero. This symposium falls on the heels of COP26, and that mantra there was to keep 1.5 alive, and the conference was also billed as humanity's last best hope. I'd like to start out with each of our panelists sharing some insights on what happened at the Climate Summit in Glasgow and how Canada showed there. I'll start with you, Dale Beugin.
Thanks, Hannah. Well, it was a really interesting COP. It was my first COP, so I was in Glasgow for a bit, and I'd never been to one before, so it was very educational. And I think there's lots of success to point to in this COP. I mean, if all the commitments that various countries have brought to that COP are followed through on, then we are looking at warming that is probably less than 2 degrees, which is a big step forward from where we have been in previous COPs and in previous years. We are starting to see momentum in policy and in markets. There is a but there that those commitments have to be followed through. They have to be backed up by action. They have to be backed up by policies to actually deliver on those ambitions. And that's not a sure thing. So I guess my big takeaway from COP, and this is a sort of epiphany after this COP for me, that there's never going to be a successful COP. There's never going to be the one COP that solves this problem. There's never going to be the one meeting that we can walk away and say, oh, well, we're done. That issue is done. The problem is solved. It's going to be this ongoing iteration of process where countries across the world are bringing new commitments, bringing new demonstrated action, bringing new levers that they have pulled and are demonstrating to the rest of the world how they're pulling them to incrementally move towards more progress, to amping up ambition. That's exactly how the Paris Agreement was designed, to ratchet up ambition. So the wins are all sort of small wins rather than one big win. But I think we should acknowledge those small wins, that they are momentum on the way. And those wins are things like India committing to net zero by 2070, agreements between the US and China, new deals on aluminum and steel between the EU and the US, some rules on Article 6, that's the trading agreements to enable kind of emissions trading between countries. Those are all big wins, but they also aren't enough. There's still more to do.
That's a very optimistic take, Dale. Catherine Harrison, I'll go to you next. What do you make of the COP26 outcomes?
Well, I'm still in Scotland and watching events unfolding in my home province of British Columbia with horror. So I'm going to be less upbeat than Dale. We're currently at 1.1 C, and in British Columbia this year, 600 people died in extreme heat, most of them alone in their homes. The whole town of Lytton burned to the ground. We had wildfires across Western Canada with terrible air quality. And now we've got whole cities being evacuated, and the city of Vancouver is cut off from the rest of Canada by mudslides and landslides. So we need more than small steps. So yes, I agree that progress was made at this COP, but you know, to the extent 1.5 C is still alive, it's on life support. The analysis I look to is one that finds, so going into COP, countries' commitments were consistent with 2.7 C, coming out of COP, 2.4 C, and that figure of 1.7, 1.8 really rests on a very large number of countries, dozens of countries, translating mid-century net zero commitments into consistent 2030 targets. And there's a big gap there because, of course, a lot of countries are promising distant things without any realistic intentions of delivering in the next decade. The countries gave themselves a do-over at COP27, so there's an expectation that everyone return to the table with greater ambition. And I think the outcome of COP26 in Glasgow has a few implications for Canada. The first is there will be an expectation for Canada to be more ambitious in terms of our emissions reduction commitment for 2030. Canada's goal of 40 to 45% is less ambitious than what is needed globally if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 C. And we are one of the countries that is wealthy, that has a particularly carbon intensive economies that would be expected to do more under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in the UN Climate Treaty. I think there is a possible way forward there if Canada wanted to carefully and in a limited way take advantage of Article 6 in order to increase our ambition by purchasing reductions elsewhere in the world beyond 45%. There will be an expectation for Canada to put more money on the table. The wealthy countries committed to deliver $100 billion per year in climate finance to developing countries starting in 2020, and they broke that promise. And that is really a source of a schism, a loss of trust going forward, and still lots, much greater needs than that. I think Canada's, the way we put public funds into the fossil fuel industry will be challenged going forward. Canada's already committed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I think our governments owe citizens an explanation of what on earth an efficient fossil fuel subsidy is. But also at COP, Canada committed to end public finance for any fossil fuel project abroad, but hasn't put a deadline on that within Canada. And the last thing, I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit too long, is that even in that 1.8 to 2.4 C zone, which is less than the 1.5 that we're aiming for, I think it sends very worrying signals about the viability of Canada's heavy oil exports based on the World Energy Outlook report that came out this fall, where Canada is the first country hit by declining exports as ambition increases. And we are into that zone of that report at the end of this COP.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And Jennifer Winter, I'd like to hear your thoughts on COP26 and how Canada fared there.
Sure, it's great to be here. I think to start off with, I think I'm more on the side of Dale as, you know, a natural optimist than Kathy. I think, like, for me, I wasn't at COP, so I'm, you know, an observer, like watching the reaction in Canada. And one thing I noted is, like, some of the announcements that the Prime Minister made at COP seemed to come as a surprise to many observing in Canada. And they weren't, I mean, they shouldn't necessarily have been a surprise, but they were. So to me, that's like, there's a lot of focus on climate policy around COP, but not necessarily in day-to-day lives. And I don't know if that'll change going forward. Maybe it will, because the COP is all about ambition and setting targets and making commitments, but the hard policy work to implement those commitments, that happens at home in Canada and in other countries around the world. And I think, you know, that's where that's really what's important. Yes, these targets, these ambitions are good. They're lofty targets, but what matters is the actions countries take. And in terms of what we've seen in the last 5-10 years, Canada has come a long way. And yes, we have to do a lot more, but at the same time, we're now in a position where we're actually enacting policies to truly follow through on our ambitions, rather than just setting targets and doing a couple things, but not doing very little. And I think, you know, for future COP meetings, that's what's important, is not just saying, oh, Canada's going to do this, but coming with proof that we've actually followed through, even if partially, on our ambitions. Because I agree with Dale, it's, you know, incrementalism is really important, because it's a starting place, and so that's why I'm more optimistic.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Dale, I'd like you to get us going into the main sort of part of this panel. So the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices recently released a report on how Canada can find its way to a net zero future. And so I guess I'll start there. Is a net zero future by 2050 possible? And if so, what are some of those solutions or those ways that can help us get there?
Thanks, Hannah. So I'm going to cheat and use a visual aid here from that report that you alluded to from earlier this year. And this is a big beast of a report we released in February at the Institute that laid out more than 60 possible pathways to net zero for Canada. And Jen and Kathy both helped work on that report too. So they're almost surely going to weigh in after I have my say here. But what's interesting about this paper is that we used economic modeling to constrain these pathways to make sure we weren't relying on magical thinking, so to speak, that we weren't just inventing non-plausible paths, that there really are paths from here to there through the 2030 target onto net zero by 2050. And more, that all those pathways are internally consistent with each other, that they aren't relying on assumptions that don't make sense, whether that's the ways technologies are evolving here in Canada or whether they're evolving market conditions internationally. We've constrained ourselves to make sure that these were kind of real, credible pathways. So the answer to your question is yes, there are pathways for Canada to achieve its 2030 targets and then on to net zero by 2050. But in order for it to walk those paths, it requires really aggressive and significant policy to create the incentives to deploy those solutions. So I'm going to use my slide here just to illustrate a little bit about what those pathways might look like and where there is uncertainty and certainty on those pathways. So across those very different 60 plus scenarios, we ended up finding this key finding that there were lots of things that occurred on almost all those pathways. There were consistent solutions, no matter what assumptions we made about technological change or international market conditions. And we called those solutions that show up again and again safe bets, that they are a key part of the solution and the pathway to 2050. But they're especially important in 2030, and that at least 2/3 of the emissions reductions by 2030 to hit the 2030 target require and rely on these safe bet technologies. And these kind of familiar technologies, and the previous panel on technologies alluded to some of these too, but they're things like electric vehicles, like energy efficiency. They are things that show up again and again and again. So that brings a little bit of clarity to our conversation about what it is we really need to do to get to 2030. The story in 2050 is a bit different. Let's see if I can slide. Yes. No, I can't. Okay, technical help. Technical wizards in the background. Hey. Apparently I went too far. There we go. Still at 2030. There we go, 2050. So the story changes in 2050. And by 2050, the other part of the story, the wild cards, the things that might become really important technologies, it might be game changers for what's possible in delivering 2050 net zero goals, start to become a much more important part of that story. But again, these wild cards are not guarantees. They are things that might be really impactful. They're things like direct air capture that is basically sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and permanently storing it. If that technology pays off at scale and it evolves in a way that it becomes cheap and scalable and widely used, it can have a big role. On the other hand, it might never become cheap and scalable. And there is serious risks in thinking about that as an all-in strategy, betting the house on those wildcards. The safe bets have to be a fundamental piece of this story, but we also can't ignore the wildcards. So that's my bridge to our conversation today about policy. We talked about technology in the previous panel. There are different kinds of policy levers to drive the safe bets and those wildcards. The safe bets are things like carbon pricing that set the incentives to make things that produce more emissions more expensive relative to things that produce fewer or even no emissions. It's like flexible regulations that create incentives, again, for the deployment of these safe bet technologies, these low carbon solutions that create the incentives for firms and for businesses to adopt those low carbon solutions. Wildcards are a bit tricky. I think Canada and other countries have less of a good handle on what wildcard policy looks like. It is about how you can drive innovation to unleash these new technologies that might exist. Does that require putting public bets on some of these possible innovations? Does it require setting clear expectations about where carbon pricing and regulations are going in the future to give this incentive for innovators to develop those new game-changing technologies? Ultimately, though, we need to do both of those things. We need policies both for the short-term, steady deployment of those safe bet technologies. And we also need in parallel to start thinking about how we can deploy the wildcards that, yes, enable net zero, but also could be new sources of economic growth for Canada in a net zero global economy. Hannah, I'll go back to you.
Thanks very much, Dale. I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about those safe bets that you mentioned. You mentioned EV, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, carbon pricing. What more can Canada do to support those safe bets so that in the short term, they're really bringing those emissions down and they're helping us hit those 2030 targets?
So when you're thinking about policy architecture, then you can think about the toolkit being something like this. Like you've got carbon pricing that's going to rely on markets. It's going to use market forces to create incentives to deploy those technologies. You've got regulatory policies that's basically requiring firms to meet certain levels of performance, whether it's emissions intensity or even specific technologies. And you can start to blur the lines there by making those regulations as flexible and as market-driven as possible that rely on tradable permits or things like that to minimize the costs of requiring firms to make these changes. Or you can go to subsidies where you're using public dollars to pay firms and individuals to adopt these low carbon technologies. The danger with that last category is, number one, it can be expensive, especially because you're paying people to do things they might do anyway. Think high income Tesla buyers that might have bought that Tesla irrespective of the subsidy they received to do so. But also that it requires government to think about which specific technology they want to subsidize or not. So there's some risks there. Across all of those, you really need stringency. You really need, it's not just the policy itself, it's the level of ambition and incentive behind the policy that's really going to drive change or not.
I'm glad you brought up stringency because one of the things that you mentioned as the safe bet, obviously, is carbon pricing, and that's really been central to Canada's policies thus far. And are the existing policies on carbon pricing stringent enough? We've seen the carbon pricing regime was sort of implemented in 2019, and so we've had it for almost 2 years. The price has already increased, and it's projected it's going to continue rising to $170 per ton in 2030. So is this enough? Does anyone want to jump into that? Catherine, maybe?
Sure, I'll jump in. From the federal government's modeling in late last year, when they were presenting a plan to make a 30% reduction, they showed that $170 per ton was consistent with that. If we were going to meet our new target of a 40% reduction by the same period, we would need a higher carbon price or heavier reliance on other tools like regulation, especially. And I think looking at Dale's slides, I'm struck that the safe bets, the things we should be able to do, actually present in some ways the most challenging politics. And the wild cards are easy to do politically, and in fact, some ways too easy. So by that, I mean carbon pricing tends to be unpopular. It's a tough political sell because the costs are visible. It's an unfamiliar policy tool. And, to some degree, it's natural that people would be skeptical of that. But the real problem we've got is that it's become a partisan debate. And some polling that I did with colleagues comparing people subject to the federal carbon tax in Saskatchewan and Ontario, what we found is that pretty much everyone underestimated how much money they were getting back in tax credits, but conservatives underestimated it by much more. And when we showed them correctly how much money their household was getting back, the conservatives still underestimated it by more, and it didn't affect their support for the policy. They assumed that they must be paying even more if they were getting this much back. So we've had partisan politicians playing carbon policy to their own ends. They've often been misleading or downright incorrect in their statements, and it's created quite toxic politics. With the wild cards, I think it's more likely to be an industrial policy subsidizing those sectors either directly or indirectly through tax cuts. And that's tricky because they love to get money. They will be delighted to get our tax dollars. And in fact, there will be a temptation to put a lot of tax dollars in sectors that arguably will not be competitive, that are not good bets, even in the wild cards by 2050.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I wanted to touch on one of the solutions that's been put forward at COP26 and also sort of been talked a lot within Canada, and that's the idea of these nature-based solutions and using forests and other ways to sequester carbon dioxide. Obviously, this takes up a lot of land, and policies that would be put into place would have to take into account Indigenous people's rights on title. And it would also raise the question of land use. Do we use a field for agriculture, or do we use it for a solar farm? And so I'm wondering how, first of all, where nature-based solutions sort of fit into this idea of safe bets and wildcards, but also how these aspects will affect the policies that are put in place as we move along these pathways to net zero.
I'll take a shot if you want, Hannah, before the
that'd be great.
Chime in. The somewhat controversially, based on the number of conversations I've had with people about this report, we included nature-based solutions and natural sequestration as a way of removing emissions from the atmosphere through nature as a wild card rather than a safe bet. And that raised lots of alarm bells and consternation from lots of voices that we talked to. The reason we did that is really about permanence, is the extent to which those nature-based solutions are going to permanently store carbon. If you are planting trees, for example, or reforesting areas as a way to sequester carbon, there's the risk, and it's increasing risk in a globally warming world, that I'm muted. There we go. That forest might burn, and that it might actually release that carbon, and it might not be permanent storage at all. So that's not to say it shouldn't be part of the solution space, and we should be thinking about policies, and they can tie into those policy instruments we talked about in kind of interesting ways. You can create offset regimes, for example, that would allow emitters to avoid paying carbon prices if instead they are investing in things that they can demonstrate are going to reduce emissions. Now, again, the key is that burden of making sure those are really high quality offsets, that they are emissions sequestration that wouldn't have happened otherwise, that is going to be guaranteed, or at least high likelihood of lasting over a long period of time. And by constraining how those offsets work, you can kind of improve the quality. On the other hand, there's a case for maybe separating that from carbon trading systems altogether and using public dollars to drive those investments because they have lots of benefits beyond emissions reductions. Part of the nature-based solution value proposition is that it can improve resilience through avoided flooding. If you are talking about peats and wildlife, it can have biodiversity benefits. It can have kind of human well-being benefits. So maybe the solution is to think of that as a separate piece of the puzzle that goes alongside those emissions reductions policy.
Thanks very much. Catherine Harrison, I'd like to turn to you for the next question. And you mentioned how the carbon pricing had become very much political or partisan debate. And so I'm wondering more broadly, what are the politics behind how we might deliver some of these solutions? And what role does federalism play? Do you see that as an opportunity, or is it an obstacle?
I think we tend to embrace a very celebratory view of federalism in Canada, that there's diversity among the provinces, so it's great that they can adopt their own policies, that 10 heads are better than one, so we can see innovation, and then the good ideas, the best policies will diffuse across the country. And the classic example there is Medicare, and that even in the absence of innovative policies, we can see leadership, one or more provinces that are willing to stick their necks out and do the difficult thing and provide assurance to others. And we've seen some of that. We saw BC's revenue neutral carbon tax, which I think is arguably innovative. It was the first really sort of pure design of that sort. Quebec and California were the first jurisdictions to extend emissions trading to transportation emissions and home heating. But what we don't tend to talk about is the negative side of Canadian federalism. And I would argue that's mostly prevailed in climate policy for 30 years in this country. In a federal system, especially one where provincial governments own the fossil fuels, that system creates stronger opposition from provincial governments. We had innovation, but we didn't see diffusion because the most carbon intensive provinces simply weren't interested in following the leaders. And then we saw obstruction because we have this expectation, although it is not a constitutional requirement that there should be consensus between the federal government and provincial governments. And historically, the carbon-intensive provinces, especially Alberta, but on regulation of the motor vehicle industry, Ontario, have just said no. And that really blocked progress in Canada-wide climate policies for 25 years. So I think on balance, federalism has been very unhelpful. What changed in the last few years is the current federal government rejected that norm of federal provincial consensus. They were willing to threaten unilateral carbon pricing and then follow through on it. So I think that was important. I do think we still ended up with a pretty ugly patchwork across the provinces. The good news is that it seems like the federal government in this second round post 2022 is starting to close some of the loopholes to make to ensure greater consistency across provinces. And of course, they won in the Supreme Court of Canada that they are in fact constitutionally allowed to do that. But we see just in the last few days, Premier Kenney of Alberta saying the federal government is required to consult with Alberta because we own the oil. And no, they're not, actually. Under the Constitution, they're required to act on their jurisdiction. But I think the reason that consultation is talked about is that effectively it has given Alberta a veto for decades.
Thanks very much. Jennifer, I'm hoping that this would be a good place for you to weigh in since you're in Alberta. Could you weigh in a bit more on how the provincial government's role in this pathway to net zero? Is it going to be smooth and well-defined path for the entire country, or do you see it as being a little bit messier?
Canada is wonderfully messy. It's, you know, different provinces do different things. They have different circumstances. And I guess, you know, in an ideal world, we would all do the same thing. We would have consistent policy and life would be good. But that's, you know, that's not the case in climate policy. It's not the case in any area of policy across Canada. And so I guess for me, I'm less concerned about policy consistency. I think we'll hopefully iterate towards it. Yes, it's higher cost to have these differences in different provinces, but at the same time, it also gives provinces flexibility. And with something as serious as climate change and reducing emissions, sometimes that flexibility is necessary in the short term. Like, let's be very clear. Sometimes this flexibility really is necessary in the short term as part of the transition. You know, for example, provinces in Atlantic Canada, they were given a heating oil exemption from the federal carbon price as part of their equivalency agreement. And that's because households had limited ability to switch from heating oil. So, you know, it undermines that incentive to switch, but that's where we get into the issue of carbon pricing is not a silver bullet. We need complementary policies. In terms of leadership, some provinces are leaders, some provinces are laggards, and, you know, maybe it was a blip, but we did have a really nice period in Alberta, where Alberta was a leader on climate policy. And it set, it is sort of the standard which the federal government followed for large emitter systems and a means-tested rebate to households so that the use of revenues was focused on lower income households rather than spreading the rebates across all taxpayers in Alberta. And so really who is a leader and who is a laggard depends on politics, individual circumstances, and I also just want to remind everyone that it's not just Alberta that's bad, or Saskatchewan that's bad. We've also had Ontario flip-flop between leadership and laggardliness, and so it's the federal government does have an important role in pushing everyone along. But that's also only been recently, which is part of the challenge.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Dale, was there anything that you wanted to add to that part of the discussion about the provinces versus the federal government and moving towards this path to net zero?
Yeah, maybe a nuance that slides right in between Kathy and Jen, that there's, in the last few years at least, it feels like Canada has gotten better at navigating the challenges of federalism that Kathy has articulated. And that is all about choosing where there is flexibility to give provinces how to tailor their own policies versus constraining some of those design choices to make sure that they're really working. But that balance between flexibility and kind of prescription is arguably leading to better policy and more stable policy. So carbon pricing, for example, the best way to think of that, or the best example there of flexibility that is good flexibility, is how revenue is used. One of the features of the Pan-Canadian framework and how we think about carbon pricing now across the country is that, number one, revenue is not generated in one province and recycled in a different province. So it's not generated and then used somewhere else. There's no transfer of revenue between regions. And given how asymmetric those provinces and territories are in terms of how emissions intensive they are, that's really important for a sort of interprovincial fairness question, and has overcome some of the political frictions, not all the political frictions. It's also created this room for provinces to choose how they use their own revenue if they want to take that opportunity, if they want to do what BC originally did by using carbon tax revenue to cut corporate income taxes to lower the load. That was the original BC carbon tax. Do they want to use revenue, like Jen alluded to, like Alberta did, to make sure low-income households aren't being disproportionately affected? The federal government's doing that as well. But they want to, like Quebec's doing, use revenue to kind of drive innovation and deploy more technologies over and above the carbon price, ideally, if designed well. That flexibility kind of accommodates some of the differences across the regions and the different political contexts, while still maintaining the things that really matter, that common incentive, that common coverage of carbon price. And I think the federal government is working a little harder to make sure that those minimum standards are the right minimum standards. But that, again, is progress for me in navigating that landscape of federalism.
Thanks so much, Dale. Jennifer, I want to stick on this topic of carbon pricing a bit. And you have done some recent research about the impact of carbon pricing on Canadian households. It's been in place for a couple of years now, and so we've got a little bit of data. And so what sort of impact have you seen that it has had?
Well, obviously, anything that increases the cost of emissions is going to affect prices for households. What I find really interesting in my work is there are, I would say, like three main features of the impacts of carbon pricing for households. One is that it really differs by province, and that's because of the built energy systems. So provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where they're higher income, the electricity sector is more fossil intensive, those provinces have higher costs compared to provinces like BC, Quebec, Manitoba that are more dependent on hydro, for example. Second is the use of revenue really matters. And by this, I mean, oftentimes when we talk about what the costs of carbon pricing are for households, we pretend that the government is burning the revenue or just, throwing it into the ocean. We don't care about the revenue. And there are lots of options for use of revenue. It can be rebated to household in a lump sum manner so that everyone gets the same amount. It can be used to lower personal or corporate income taxes. It can be used to lower sales taxes. And these different mechanisms, they affect the net cost to households. And in most cases, when we use, say, lump sum rebates, like the federal government has done, it helps those lower income households a lot more than we would expect. And so many of the households are actually better off in terms of their the amount of income they receive relative to the cost of carbon pricing, while we still have that incentive caused by carbon pricing to reduce emissions. And then the third point is, I think, like a little bit into the weeds and a little bit nerdy, but we have in most provinces large emitter systems, and they're designed to help the industries that are called emissions intensive and trade exposed to weather the transition and reduce the cost of carbon pricing for those industries. But what's really interesting is that policy has a non-trivial effect in mitigating those indirect costs to households. So like the costs embedded in buying a banana at a grocery store because it had to be transported from wherever bananas come from, for example. and so these policies are in many ways simple, in many ways complicated, but they are an important part of our package in reducing emissions.
Interesting how you're sort of saying that there is this sort of this ongoing effect into the different sectors from this. With the sort of forecast or sort of projected increase in carbon pricing down the road, can we expect to see households experience these same benefits in the future as well, or would there be a shift?
So that really depends on how much households change their behavior as a result of carbon pricing. So if no one changes their behavior and we just keep going, which I don't believe would happen for the record, but it's entirely possible for some households that we're just able to absorb the increase in costs. So if in that like extreme state of the world, the costs increase, but that also means that the revenue increases. And so we can expect to see the same sort of net benefit going forward. Of course, as the cost of carbon pricing increases, we're set to go to $170 a ton, but by 2030, that's going to ratchet up the incentive to change behavior. And so it can be like, really simple. It's the next time someone goes to buy a car, they think really carefully about whether or not they want an electric vehicle or a gasoline vehicle, or they think about mileage. And it also creates the incentive on the business side to move away slowly from more, fossil intensive, say, electricity sources longer term. So in that instance, the more individuals and the more businesses change their behavior, the lower the costs that they face, and correspondingly the lower revenue, so they can expect to see lower rebates. But in general, we would expect to see, as people change their behavior, the costs they face are lower. Thanks.
So I want to pose this question to the panel, and so anyone who wants to jump in and answer this can. But we've obviously sort of put carbon pricing sort of the center of our policies so far. And I'm curious to know if you think that Canada is relying too heavily on carbon pricing at the expense of other tools to cut emissions, or what choices or trade-offs we might need to make in the short and medium term to further lower emissions that the carbon price can't tackle. Catherine, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. I think that there's a limit to how much we've been willing to rely on carbon pricing. And that's why even when we announced a more ambitious target, the federal government didn't announce a more ambitious schedule in the carbon price for that target. And instead, what they proposed are a whole bunch of sectoral regulations a clean electricity standard, zero emission vehicle standard, tightening the methane regulations, a cap and decline from oil and gas extraction emissions, and they still have to finalize a clean fuel standard. And what worries me about that is, at least in the first instance, it tends to be easier politically because voters somehow don't believe that the producers of those goods are going to pass the costs on to them. But when they do, it actually can become quite controversial politically. So regulation isn't necessarily as easy as it's assumed. But the other thing that really worries me is it's slow. The thing about the carbon price schedule, it's just there, boom, this is what's going to happen, sort it out among yourselves. Whereas when governments develop sectoral regulations, there's typically this expectation that they are setting standards that are technologically achievable, that will be that won't hinder the competitiveness of these sectors. And it typically takes several years to finalize regulations because they publish a draft and they get comments and they have meetings, they published a new draft. And we don't have that kind of time. So we'll have to get a whole lot better at environmental regulation than Canada has ever been before if we're going to rely on those standards, as the federal government is promising, to close that gap between 30% and 40 to 45.
Thanks so much. Dale, did you want to jump in there too about weighing in on choices and trade-offs that Canada might have to make in the future?
Yeah, I definitely want in on this one too. And I'm glad Kathy did the politics, because now I don't have to. But from an economic perspective, there's interesting questions here too. So kind of in the purest sense, in the broadest sense, the more you rely on carbon pricing, the cheaper your emissions reductions are going to be, and the lower cost your pathway to deliver on targets is going to be. So there's some trade-offs there, potentially between politics and what's politically plausible versus what is cost-effectively optimal from an economic perspective. And governments have to make that trade-off. They have to do that themselves about what is politically possible, while also still thinking about minimizing costs. There's another piece there though too, because carbon pricing can't do everything, even from an economic perspective. There is clear rationales for using the right kinds of complements to carbon pricing. So one rationale is you go after the emissions that aren't covered by carbon pricing, maybe because they're hard to measure or hard to track. So we're using regulations for upstream oil and gas for methane leaks and methane regulations, because it's hard to track those to some extent and therefore hard to price them. There's a case for going beyond carbon pricing for those kind of things. The same is true for agricultural emissions. Burps and farts from cows and livestock are big contributors of methane to the atmosphere, but really hard to track and therefore hard to price without somehow measuring the emissions from individual cows. There's also another rationale too about things that the market doesn't do on its own. So a great example is sort of networks, that things that only happen with sort of collective action. So whether it's a network of charging stations for electric vehicles or grids for electricity, those sort of things have a different rationale for public investment and different rationale for policy interventions to make happen. And those kind of things go alongside carbon pricing. Aside from the political rationales that Kathy's making rightly, there are also kind of economic rationales for building out this system in different ways. It works best when you think about what carbon pricing does and what it doesn't do pretty carefully.
Thank you so much. And Jennifer, did you also want to jump in there?
Yeah, one point I'd like to make is that regardless of what approach Canadian federal, provincial, or territorial governments take, whether it's carbon pricing or regulation, a key thing that I think is really overlooked is policy certainty. And that is, right now, carbon pricing and whatever regulations are being developed and implemented, there's some short-term certainty about the direction of policy. And we have a carbon price out to 2030. That's, 2030 is not that long from now, unfortunately. And, the recent policy changes in Alberta I think, give a great example of what not to do in providing policy certainty. So in 2015, we had a switch in government in Alberta, and the Alberta government started developing new regulations for large emitters. And to Kathy's point, it took them almost 4 years to finally develop those regulations for large emitters. And then 2019, we had an election and the government switched from NDP to the United Conservative Party. And immediately there was a policy switch, eliminating Alberta's carbon tax, moving forward to changing the large emitters regulation again. And that sort of switch, that really undermines the incentives of businesses and even households to invest in things that will reduce their emissions and reduce their costs. And this is, just one of the big challenges of our 4-year or 2-year electoral cycles is the lack of policy certainty for making long-term decisions.
I guess I'd like to pick up on that. I mean, I think it's a really important point that you bring up in the lack of policy certainty and the effects that can have both on industry and households. Is there a way to then bake that in to make sure that the policies are more certain, that there is more consistency over time?
It's a tricky thing to do because governments can't be constrained, but here's a few ideas to throw into the mix. So one is this idea of accountability frameworks. So the federal government has created this bill C12 that kind of creates stock taking and transparency mechanisms that constrain future governments, because it's legislation, at least constrain them a little bit, to respond as to how they are doing on delivering on interim milestones. So because it's not perfect, because future governments could unlegislate legislation, so to speak, but it does create more momentum and more inertia around these pathways. There might be other kind of smaller things on the margins too. I wrote a paper with one of Jen's colleagues at U of C that argued the infrastructure bank could be an interesting mechanism here, that the infrastructure bank for major projects could be sort of guaranteeing financing for big projects conditional on future carbon prices. And if those future carbon prices ended up changing because of changes in governments, then the infrastructure bank would pay the difference. That's a sort of insurance for project proponents to give them the certainty they need, but it also creates incentives for governments who are paying those infrastructure bank bills to adhere to their predecessors' commitments on carbon pricing trajectories, because otherwise they're paying for projects that might not be economic with those swings in carbon prices. I mean, the big answer is we need to continue to build some kind of buy-in from voters and the population around the need to commit to these pathways. But I'm venturing into Kathy's territory there, so I'll stay away.
Thanks so much, Dale. So I want to sort of move into Canada and its role in relationship with the rest of the world when we're talking about reducing emissions and moving towards a net zero position. So according to the Climate Action Tracker, Canada's emissions targets currently fall well short of the global goal to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and its policies and actions are highly insufficient. I'm wondering, and maybe Dale, I'll start with you actually, what do you think we can expect to see in the next year or so when it comes to climate policy and regulations? Do you think there's specific sectors we might see targeted first, especially now that we have these climate ambitions baked into law?
Yeah, well, under that legislation I talked about, the C12, the federal government owes a plan for delivering on the 2030 target. And they have technically to the end of the year, but I think there's also a grace period that drifts into next year. So sometime soon, 3 months, Kathy says, we'll see something soon, and I'm expecting to see something kind of concrete. And I don't think we should be surprised at what's in that plan, because there's been lots of conversations about maybe a vehicle emission standard for the transportation sector. So that's regulations that start to require shares of sales being electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. But there's also lots of conversation at Glasgow and since about a cap on emissions for the oil and gas sector, which is a major source of emissions in the country. It has been a growing source of emissions. So that's new policy. And I think we don't yet know exactly what shape that policy is going to take. And it's a live conversation across the country about how aggressive that cap should be and the form it should take. But it's also not totally out there either. Lots of those oil and gas firms have themselves committed to net zero. Alberta had previously adopted a notional cap on emissions for the oil sands sector with the support of the industry. So there's devils and details to wrestle with, but those are some of the issues that are live.
Thanks so much. Jennifer, what do you think we might see when it comes to climate policy and regulations in the next few months?
So to start with, we're 5 years after the announcement, not necessarily implementation of the Pan-Canadian framework. And so Environment and Climate Change Canada is going through the process of evaluating and benchmarking all of the provincial climate plans for those that, like, say, BC, had implemented their own plans. So BC, Quebec, for example, and then for those provinces that, like Ontario and Alberta, that have a combination of the federal plan and their own policy development. So that's going to be key, because it'll be a discussion of, are these provincial climate plans really truly equivalent to that federal minimum standard? And if not, what exemptions are going away? And how do these provinces need to increase their stringency? So that's something really key to watch for. I think the other thing that'll be really important as all of these other complementary policies roll out, like the clean fuel standard, the clean electricity standard, et cetera, is how they interact with the policies that we have in place, like the carbon tax on households and small businesses, like the system for large emitters, and how the federal government and the provinces, cooperatively or uncooperatively, develop this, and where there's where there's overlap, because Canada's approach has been, yes, let's do carbon pricing, and that's out in front of everyone, but there's lots of other stuff going on in the background that mainly relies on regulation. And that means there's it's a really complicated policy development process, because anyone proposing a regulation or commenting on the regulation, you really have to consider how it interacts with all the other things going on. And that means that it's really not going to be simple to just say, okay, here's a clean electricity standard, let's go.
Thank you so much. Catherine, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I think as Canada's ambition increases, and especially as we turn to a particularly emissions intensive sector, oil and gas extraction, we are going to see growing pressure for offsets, both domestic offsets and international offsets. And offsets, so basically an opportunity for a firm that is facing regulations to pay someone else to make those reductions for them. In domestic offsets tend to be things like forestry and agriculture, which the forestry raises some of the questions Dale was talking about. Is it permanent? We've had some real challenges with bogus offsets in the past, but they tend to, it's very technical stuff. It lowers firms' costs. Some farmer makes a bunch of money and it looks like something good has happened, but it could in fact do nothing for the planet. So I think we're going to have to a very difficult conversation about the credibility of offsets and to what degree these firms can rely on. Similarly, internationally, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the international trading provisions. The rule book for that finalized finally at this COP in Glasgow. It seems like they've dealt with the double counting issue from the expert analysis that I've read, but there is a question of carry forward of bogus offsets from pre-2020 Kyoto Protocol offsets that had less strict rules. And I think Canada needs to say no to those. There's a big question of to what degree firms will be able to rely on international trading. And a series of federal environment and climate change ministers have said, we're going to meet our target through domestic means. There is going to be a lot of pressure for them to relax that. I think the greatest justification is if Canada increases its ambition beyond our current target. But yeah, that's one that I'm watching going forward.
So you bring up the sort of that constant pressure of energy security in terms of how that influences political decisions in a way. And I'm right now we're sort of it seems like what we saw at COP with in terms of initially the support to cut financial support to coal and reduce methane emissions, but then we never really hit that mark in terms of agreement to phase out coal. And so I'm wondering why, and if you have a crystal ball, for how long are we going to continue to see energy security trump climate action for many nations, including Canada? And what are some of the ways that Canada can have a role in sort of incentivizing those carbon neutral approaches? Catherine, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, most of the emissions growth now is coming from developing countries. These are low-income countries. In many cases, the growth is coming from the electricity sector. India was the spoiler on the coal phase-out language. It is a country that still has 200 million people that don't have electricity. So the way forward in those countries is going to be cleaner electricity for sure. But I think the way to help that happen is through climate finance from the wealthy countries that caused this problem. And although, sure, we may not have known at the time that fossil fuels cause global warming, we did get rich doing it. And so I think there's both a moral obligation and self-interest on Canada's part to provide greater support to developing countries in taking a cleaner path than we did.
Dale or Jennifer, do either of you want to add to that?
Jen, do you want to go? I can if not. I want to flip that somewhere a little bit different, Hannah, if that's okay. There's kind of this other aspect of international action that we're seeing at COP and in these other international arenas. And that poses a different sort of risk and opportunity set for the Canadian economy, right? If the world does follow through on these commitments, if the developing world does take those pathways that Kathy's talking about, that has huge implications for international markets for oil and gas and for coal. And those shifts in those markets might come much faster than domestic producers and domestic policymakers are thinking that they will. There's opportunities for kind of what replaces them as well. But given that Canada is such a trade-intensive nation and those international markets matter so much for our kind of overall prosperity, but also the well-being of individual communities and individual regions in the country, this is a thing that we need to be looking at in pretty eyes open ways. This isn't just about the imperative to reduce emissions and avoid more of the disasters that BC is seeing. There's also a need to make sure that Canada is relying on sources of economic growth that are robust to these changes that are coming in international markets. So that's a new dynamic. That is a new part of the story that is starting to shape how investment and capital flows are thinking about this in a really different way, and poses some interesting challenges for Canadian policymakers too, about how they try to make that transition and that shift smooth rather than bumpy.
Thanks so much, Dale. Jennifer, Catherine, is there anything else you want to add about that in terms of what Canada can do to prepare for these market shifts?
Yeah, I think I'd like to bring the conversation back to the wild cards. And, this is one of the things that we're not quite sure about. But the relationship between Canada and other nations, say in offset markets, that also provides an opportunity. And so two of the wildcards that Dale mentioned are carbon capture and storage and direct air capture. And these are two technologies that direct capture sucks emissions out of the atmosphere, and capture is capturing emissions as they're part of the production process. And that's actually one of the really interesting wildcard opportunities for Canada because, and for Western Canada in particular, because we have great geology. And so that means that with functioning offset markets, with long-term policy certainty, it's a real opportunity for new investment in these technologies that mean that Canada could be a source of emissions offsets for other countries, which I think is it is a wild card. So it's not, and it's definitely not a silver bullet, and there's a lot of uncertainty about it, but it is one of these, longer term things that we can look for. And so it's a new technology, relies on existing expertise, and it's sort of this really forward-looking thinking that is going to support a smooth transition rather than, panicked reaction to what the rest of the world does.
Yep, go ahead, Catherine.
The question of how big the risk is for Canada's exports, I think we haven't really confronted how soon that could be. So the World Energy Outlook report this fall had different scenarios. One of them was 2.7, which is current policies. That's not a prediction of the future because it's completely implausible that no country will change their policies for the next 30 years. There was then a announced pledges scenario equivalent to 2.1C. Now, that I think was pretty generous in interpreting net zero pledges, but it's kind of right in between that zone where COP26 landed between 1.8 and 2.4C. And what the IEA predicted is that Canada's exports would decline by 2030 under that 2.1C scenario. So this isn't some distant future thing. This is a transition that could start now or next year. And that is where I think the commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies and presumably soon as well public finance for fossil fuels creates revenue that can be used to support those workers and communities that are likely to face a significant transition. And if it's governments that are putting them out of business, I think quite justified. The other thing is when we talk about net zero for oil industry emissions, in almost all cases, they're only talking about the emissions to extract that oil within Canada, not the combustion emissions or even the refining emissions, which are higher for Canada's relatively low quality oil. So that's why we're vulnerable. And that's a really big challenge that's coming at us very fast.
Thank you so much. We're going to sort of start wrapping things up here. But before we do that, I'd like to close by asking each of you, what you sort of think is either the most interesting part of this discussion we've had today, or you've sort of had giving you the most things to think about, or where you sort of see Canada's future in domestically or internationally in terms of the policies that we're going to be implementing and the regulations in the short-term future. Catherine, why don't you go first?
I think we covered a lot of really interesting ground, and this was fun. And I've never been on a panel where someone said burps and farts before. So congratulations, Dale.
I'm here for you, Kathy. I'm here. Enteric fermentation, if you prefer.
I think one thing we haven't we've kind of danced around a bit is the administrative challenges that governments face. They have a lot of work cut out for them to adjust those policies, to sort out the equivalency between federal and provincial governments, to set new regulatory standards and update them at regular intervals and enforce them. So there's just a lot of hard work for Canadian governments coming their way.
Thanks very much. Jennifer.
Kathy made a great point. It is going to be incredibly challenging and hard. And, we think about it, it's not just federal government acting policy, it's 13 provinces and territories, each with their unique constraints and political issues. And, that unfortunately, I think means that policy change is going to be slower than some want and also faster than others want. It's part of the beautiful, complicated mess that is Canada and Canadian federalism. That said, I am optimistic because, notwithstanding some resistant provinces, the last federal election, every party had a lengthy, detailed climate plan. And, I personally had quibbles with the things in each of those climate plans, but its climate policy is mainstream. And, unfortunately, it takes disasters like we've seen this summer and right now in British Columbia to really drive it home. But climate policy is becoming mainstream, or is mainstream right now. It's becoming more important. And I think the only thing holding us back is the fact that climate policy is not the only thing our governments are concerned with and have to care about. And that's just an unfortunate fact. And it really is going to both help and hinder further action.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I'll leave the final word to you.
I'll finish with some optimism, just like I started. And maybe this is hopeful, wishful optimism, but it feels like we are hitting an inflection point of sorts here. And partly what Jen just talked about the kind of emerging political, white consensus, but something closer to consensus than we've ever had about the imperative for strong, effective climate policy. But it's also about the increasing momentum in private capital markets, and that private investors now are putting their money behind low carbon solutions because they see those risks that we talked about earlier as a reason that they have to protect their long-term returns. They want things that are robust to domestic and global low carbon transitions. And moreover, they especially want certainty about where policy is going. And that kind of pressure to maintain and commit to ambitious climate policy, not just to drive the emissions reductions we need, but also to create kind of transparency and certainty about the paths that we're on to allow markets to work their magic, is also a sort of positive feedback loop here that can help accelerate that transition. Doesn't mean there's not lots of work to do. There clearly is lots of policy still needed, lots of effort in communicating and getting buy-in for those policies still needed. But it feels like we have started at least to turn a corner that's been maybe far, far overdue.
Thank you so much. I'd really like to thank all the panelists again for joining us, and the audience as well, in this really insightful and clear discussion on the policy pathways to net zero. And I'd also like to extend a great thanks to the Royal Society of Canada and all of those who helped pull this panel together. Have a great afternoon at the rest of the sessions.